So, I'm going to go through the groups that I have thus far. I have Ali and Leisha in a group, Vanessa and Crystal in a group, and Miranda and Abigail in a group. If you're not in a group yet, feel free to let me know who you want to work with. If you never tell me who you want to work with, then by the end of today, I'm going to just randomly assign you a person to work with. So congratulations. Those of you that have already specified who you want to work with, you can go ahead and share contact info with them. But starting on Monday, we are going to begin working on those projects in class. You're going to want to bring your books next week too, like every day next week, because all we're going to be doing is working on your presentations, and you got to choose an object from the book. So you're going to need your book to do that. You can try and do it without a book, but it'll be a little bit hard. Any questions about group partners or anything like that? Like I said, if by the end of today you never ever specify who you want to work with, then I'll just randomly assign you a person, and tomorrow you can get their information. Don't feel bad if you don't know who you want to work with, because my 9:30 class just decided they don't care. So I'm going to get to randomly assign all of them because they don't care who they work with. So you're not alone. There's a lot of you that just don't have a preference, which is totally fine. Today we are starting chapter 16, which is over Greek, Roman, and Christian art. This is another one, like when I teach my art history survey course, Greek art takes a whole week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, just for Greek art. Then Roman art takes another 3 days, and Christian art takes another 2 days. So we're cramming something that usually takes a little over 2 weeks into 1 hour and 20 minutes. That said, this is obviously going to be a very brief overview of those particular topics, beginning with some key terms that we're going to be using mostly, well, all of these are for Greek art. There's a lot more to all of these topics than what we're covering today. For example, with Greek art, there's a bunch of different periods and tons of art made in each one of those periods. But in this class, we only get to look at about 1 or 2 examples of each one, just because we got to go through a lot really fast. Same with Roman art. Roman art is usually divided into several periods. In this class, we only talk about one. So yeah, very, very brief surface level introduction to the topic today. Some of the terms that we're going to come across, once again, for Greek art only, we'll do Roman and Christian later. Crater is a large vessel with handles primarily used when mixing wine and water. So this large clay basin would be used at parties as well as funeral ceremonies. The Greeks liked to have parties when someone died, kind of as a celebration of their life. They would have big banquet feasts when someone passed away. And at the banquets, they would have wine and water mixed in these really large craters. So think of it as like a really, really big punch bowl that's like a few feet high and a little over a foot wide, really big. Kore is the word for archaic female figure. Kore and Koros both fall under the archaic period of art, which is one of the first periods that we're going to talk about today. Like it says, kore is a female, koros is a male. That only exists, well, that word is only used during the Archaic period. So after that period, they won't use that anymore. They're just saying male and female instead. Contrapposto means counterpoised. Yesterday, when we talked about Menkare's statue with his queen, we mentioned that when you take a step forward, usually your hips will move a little bit, but the Egyptians didn't do it anatomically correct. The Greeks are going to invent contrapposto, and the way that is if you have a foot stepping forward, it does show your hips and your shoulders moving appropriately and anatomically. Counterpoise is all about having most of your weight on one foot. And when you put almost all of your weight on one foot, your shoulders and hips and knees are going to be in different positions, not identical like the Egyptians did. So a little background for Greek history, some common misconceptions that I get because this is a really brief overview. The Greeks had already been making art a long time prior to what we're talking about today. Like I said, because it's a brief overview, we get some issues that pop up when people are writing about this later on. It's not like they just woke up one day and said, let's make art, everyone. They've been making art for a very, very long time already. We today are going to be covering Greek art following 900 BCE, but they'd already, like I said, been making art for several thousand years prior. The main periods we're going to be talking about today are the geometric period. The geometric period is a minor period, so it's not considered one of the three big periods. The geometric period roughly lasts from 900 BCE to 700 BCE. And following the geometric period is the Archaic period from roughly 700 BCE to 480 BCE. But same deal, it's not like 700 BCE, everyone got out of bed that morning and said, we're not doing geometric art anymore, we're only doing Archaic. Not how that works. So there is interchangeable flow throughout time, just like with trends today. It's not like everyone wakes up and decides they're not going to wear a side part anymore, although that kind of happened. That's not how it worked. There are some people that still do the old style, even though it's in the new period. Same with the classical period. That one roughly begins in 510 BCE and ends in 320, and the Hellenistic in 323, and it lasts until 31 BCE. Once again, it's not like they just up and decided we're not doing that anymore. And you're going to learn about all of the differences between these time periods today. Like I said, geometric period is a minor period. Your big three periods that you're going to be writing about in your discussion post are the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. So I don't know if you want to put a star next to those or what, but those are the big three that you're going to be writing about in your discussion post. You can write about the geometric period, but you don't need to. And like it says down at the bottom, Hellenistic means Greek-like. Istic is like, Hellen means Greek, so it literally translates to Greek-like. That was a time period in which the Romans were invading, so their art style kind of reflected that. Okay, so another really, really brief timeline. We're not going to be talking about the Minoans and Mycenaeans in this class, but that just also shows you that Greek art had already existed for a really long time. We are going to begin with the geometric period and do a little brief introduction. Then we're going to go into the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. Each of those periods, I think you can probably tell from the little pictures there, will have their own characteristics attributed to them. If you remember that discussion post, you're supposed to name the big three periods of Greek art, their characteristics, and an artwork for each one. So we're going to be doing that today. So as long as you take really good notes today, you should be fine on that. Starting off with our geometric period, which is not one of the big three, a little bit of a minor one. The geometric period gets its name for, you can probably tell, the geometric shapes that were used on objects. A lot of the objects that we get from the geometric period are earthenware vases, or craters or jars, and some bronze objects. This is the beginning of the Bronze Age in Greece. So we do have a few little small bronze statues from them. But one thing that reigns true throughout all of them is basic geometric shapes are used to create figures. So you can see here on the Canthoros that the human figures are made of circles, triangles, and some lines. This is not a realistic looking human. It is representational of a human, but very abstract. Same with the deer at the top. Geometric period also has a lot of repetitive geometric shapes in the patterns. This is the time period in which the Greek key is first used. The Greek key will be seen in a moment, if you're not sure what that is. But yeah, some key features of the geometric period. It marks the end of Greece's dark age in art and literature and inventions, which is the Minoan, Mycenaean, Cycladic period. And of course, like I said, it gets its name from those geometric shapes seen on the artifacts. And the second object we're going to be looking at for the geometric period is a crater. This is the terracotta crater, or the Diplon crater is what it's more popularly known as. That band at the top is that Greek key that I was mentioning. It's a very repetitive geometric pattern that is on a lot of Greek objects from the geometric period. And they still use it after the geometric period as well. But once again, a crater, what's a crater? A really, really large vessel used for mixing wine and water. This thing is about 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It's huge, really, really big. This one was not used for parties. It was used at a funeral banquet. And it was also used after the banquet as a grave marker. So the reason why it's more commonly known as the Diplon crater is because it was found in the Diplon cemetery in Greece. People that are not super familiar with Greek history, they just tend to call it a terracotta crater. And of course, there's a lot happening on each of these bands, and they tell us a little bit about the person whose grave it marked. Which is pretty common for any pottery that was left with a person or statuettes that were left with people. It tells us a little bit about their lives. The Greeks have been doing that for ages. They began doing it with the Cycladics way back in the 3000s BCE, and they're still doing it at 740 BCE as well. So here you might notice, once again, a lot of geometric shapes used for people. This person is laying down. Everyone else is standing up. That is because this man is the dead man. He is laying on his funeral pyre, which will be burned and lit momentarily, because that's what they did with their dead. They would basically cremate them. So he's on his pyre and he's dead already. And that checkered geometric pattern above him is his funeral cloth. So they covered him with a checkered cloth before he was burned. Everyone standing around him are mourners. They're all with their hands raised, which if you get really, really close, you can see little lines representing their arms raised to the skies. Once again, circle heads, triangle bodies. The interesting thing about all of these, though, is that the artist tried to show them as women. It's hard to make a triangle look female. So I'll show you what he did. It's kind of humorous today to think about. So we have our triangle body with our circle head and their arms are raised. To show that these were women instead of men, he added these. You get really, really close up on the object, you can tell. He added little bumps under the arms to represent breasts. Sad. Sad but funny. So that is all about his funeral ceremony in that first band. The bottom band tells us about his family history. So you'll notice some horses and men carrying shields and chariots. So that tells us that either this man was in the military or he's from a family known for famous military conquests. It's probably the second of those, just because those shields are a lot older than 740 BCE. They would have been using different shaped shields then. So most likely he's from a family that's known for a great military victory, and he wanted to celebrate that. Well, his family wanted to celebrate that with his grave marker. He was already dead, so he probably didn't get a say. He might have remade it. But yeah, so that is a little bit about that one. Another thing other than a vessel that is from the geometric period is this small bronze statue. Once again, you see very basic shapes used, nothing with a lot of detail going on. I want to use the word like low level craftsmanship, but that was just the style that was during that period. They'll get a lot more advanced later on and detailed and realistic. This showcases a story from mythology of the battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. The Lapiths are humans, Centaurs obviously not. Centaurs are horsemen. So here's your Centaur and your Lapith, or your Greek human. Now, let me ask this. Would a horseman be bigger or smaller than a human? Yeah, most people would think that the Centaur would be bigger than the human. The artist here has used hierarchic scale. Who remembers what that is? Yeah, it shows off class differences or importance differences using size. So the more important figures are larger. So even though theoretically, this is a mythological figure, in our brains, a centaur should be bigger than a human. The artist has chosen to represent the centaur smaller because he is less important than the Greek human who he is battling. Also, this goes back to, I don't know, I'd say a little bit of racism with the Greeks. The Greeks hated everyone that wasn't Greek, and they thought they were all inferior to them. Even back in the 8th century, they thought everyone outside of Greece was inferior. Anyone that was foreign was considered to be like the centaur. So barbaric, basically, and uneducated, therefore lesser than the Greek. So this was a pretty popular story, and it's going to pop up again later on in art that we're going to look at during the classical period, just because they liked to show off the fact that they felt they were better than everyone else. And we also see that our Greece representative here has won the battle because there is a spear stuck into the side of the centaur. So yeah, it shows victory, intelligence, importance, even though it looks very, very basic and plain. And that takes us to our second period, which is the first of the big three that you're going to have to write about on your discussion post, which is the Archaic period. During the Archaic period, there's a big shift and change in art, mostly because the Greeks begin to trade. Specifically, they begin to trade with the Egyptians. When they begin trading with the Egyptians, their art goes from this to looking like Egyptian art. They basically just steal the Egyptian style altogether. So you can already see they have switched from using basic geometric shapes. They're using things very realistic now. They are doing the same profile view with their depictions and illustrations that the Egyptians did. And also we are not just using basic geometric patterns, we're using a little bit of a floral design as well. But you might notice down here, the Greek key is still there. The Greek key continues on. Some key features. Shows a lot of influence from Egypt as trade increased in the area. We see the birth of the Kore and Koros, the female figure and male figure of the Archaic style. These humans were depicted in an extremely rigid frontal pose, and they are life-size, the same way the Egyptians did their statues, life-size and in a very rigid frontal pose. The arms are stiff at the side, the weight is evenly distributed. One foot stepping forward, but the hips are in level perfectly. It shows the male and female during their prime, just like with the Egyptians. They like to show off people in their prime, so muscular, fit bodies. They would have originally have been painted. They're known, though, for having really funny hair. Similar to the beard of the lyre, the bull on the lyre that we looked at yesterday with the braids. It's like that for all of the archaic statues. And they're also known for having something called the archaic smile. All of their statues are smiling. The Egyptians did not do that. It's a very dopey looking smile too. Okay, here is our Kuros, or our male youth. This is a marble statue. They also did a lot of terracotta statues during the Archaic period, which if you remember back to our ceramics section, we talked about a terracotta archaic statue from the Greeks that was life-size. But here you can see this is very much in the style of the Egyptians. They basically just stole it. Very stiff, rigid pose. The thing that's different with the Greeks and the Egyptians, though, is that the figures in Greek art are almost always nude to show off those idealized bodies in completion. And the heads are also quite a bit different. Once again, you have that braided hairstyle and a goofy little smile. And really are large eyes, oversized eyes. That's a carry-on from Minoan and Mycenaean art from the Dark Ages. The Minoans felt that large eyes were characteristic of being able to like connect with heaven and be pious. They carried it over from there. Eventually, the Greeks will stop doing that, but they're still doing it during the Archaic period. So the Archaic is a little bit of a mixture between Egypt and Greece seen here. Something that carries over from the archaic period, though, is that idea of showing youthful, idealized bodies. That's going to go all the way until the Hellenistic period. So talking about youthful, idealized figures, what age are we probably going to be trying to represent? When do you think people are in their prime? I wish. Like 20s. I wish the 30s. But no, the 20s, late teens, early 20s usually is what the Greeks are trying to represent with their idealized figures. And that's, like I said, going to carry out until the Hellenistic period. Something impressive happens then. Here's our Kore. The Kore is clothed. That's because she's a goddess. Some other Kores are not clothed. She is called the Peplos Kore because the garment she's wearing is called a peplos. Makes sense. This one's interesting because we were able to, well, I didn't, but scientists did, figure out what pigment colors would have covered this particular Kore. This is what she used to look like. So very bright and vivid. A lot of Greek art actually used to be painted. So a lot of the sculptures from the Parthenon were originally painted colors, but the paint just wore off. Same with this one. A lot of Egyptian art also used to be painted. So this one is a bit of a mystery to scholars. Like I mentioned, it's most likely representing a goddess, but people argue as to which one. She was found in the Acropolis in Athens. Most things there have to do with Athena, because I mean that's the namesake of the city. But her skirt here and her shirt shows deer and stags. That's a figure that is most usually associated with the goddess Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. So scholars are baffled as to who she's supposed to be. Most likely that arm that is outstretched, which is very rare for archaic style art, would have held an object to identify her. But as we no longer have that arm, we don't know who she is. But yeah, usually they don't have those outstretched arms. You can still see the clenched fist at her side on the other one though. And once again, that archaic smile, the braids. Very, very stiff looking figure though. So something big happens after the archaic period. And the thing that happens is the classical period and contrapposto. The Greeks finally realize that if you want to really show off the idealized form of the human figure, you should probably do it anatomically correct. Instead of making really stiff, rigid, improper poses. So this guy, Polykleitos, which is the first actual artist that we've mentioned in a really, really long time. Polykleitos, who made this spear bearer statue here, set about studying a lot of male nudes, like models, and figuring out what the measurements would be of the idealized male form. So he literally measured a bunch of naked men to figure out what the best measurements would be. And he also studied what happens with the body when you do different poses. So what happens with the muscles and the skeletal structure when you're in different poses. He learned that what happens is contrapposto. When you put weight on one side over the other side, your hips are no longer symmetrical. One side is going to raise up and the other side lower. In juxtaposition, your shoulders will lower on one side and raise on the other side. Same with your knees and your ankles. Things aren't going to be perfectly symmetrical like the archaic art and Egyptian art was. So he's the guy that starts off, like really starts off the classical period, and other people follow. So as you can see, not only have they figured out how to really properly illustrate human anatomy, they've also gotten a lot better at shaping the actual forms of the bodies to make them look as realistic as possible. We no longer have the really goofy smile or the braided hair. It's very natural looking expressions. These expressions for the classical period don't usually show emotions at all. So definitely no smile. Very serene, common looks on all of these statues. That'll change again in the last period. So this is the second of your big three that you're going to need to write about on your discussion post. And of course, this is a Roman copy. He has the stupid little stump and the little attachments there. This would have originally been in bronze. So, like I said, he studied a bunch of models, figured out the ideal proportions. He even wrote a book about it and published the book, which is what got a bunch of other artists starting to do that same style. The lady that cleaned my whiteboard probably wonders what the heck I do in this class. Just a bunch of random shapes. So just for fun, so yesterday we talked about the Egyptians. The Egyptian art never changes. They were trading obviously with the Greeks already during the Archaic period. So you would think that the Egyptians might contemplate adapting contrapposto as well, but they don't. This is just a funny little cartoon about that. Do you understand the hieroglyphic? Anyone. Some other classical art, it's very similar to the spear bearer. It pretty much sticks with those mathematical proportions throughout. They do tone it down a little bit. Polyclitus, the spear bearer, is like definitely over exaggerated with muscles. They did tone it down for later works, such as the Discobolus. But you can still see he's clearly in a much more dynamic, natural pose. He's not super stiff or rigid. He's performing an action instead of just standing there. Same with the spear bearer. He would have been holding a spear originally. Instead of just standing stiff like the Egyptians or archaic art, we now have movement with our subjects. Once again, a very serene face, normally a discus thrower. If you're really competing in the Olympics, which is what this dude was doing, he probably would have a bit of a strained look on his face. They didn't do that though. So we're natural, but only to the extent that it looks like perfection. It's during the classical period that they really start to emphasize the fact that Humans are the descendants of gods and goddesses, therefore humans are the closest things to those mythological beings, and we need to represent them in the perfect way that the gods and goddesses, they are perfect. So we need to look perfect too. So that's why even though this dude should have had a really strained, concentrated look on his face, he looks serene and peaceful. Because a god probably wouldn't be straining to throw a Discobolus because they don't need to. So another example of classical art is the Venus de Medici by Praxiteles, right here. This is a female example. Obviously of the goddess Venus or Aphrodite. It's called the Venus de Medici because the Medici family that was really, really powerful in Italy during the Renaissance period owned it at one point. So that's fine. Once again, it was made by Praxiteles. She is trying to cover herself to remain modest. The goddess Aphrodite is supposed to be this virginal beauty. Obviously, if you've actually read the mythological stories, you know better. But yeah, she's supposed to be represented as this virginal, modest beauty. So she is covering herself up a little bit, or at least trying to. We know it's Aphrodite because of Cupid riding a dolphin down here. If you remember back to Augustus of Prima Porta, Cupid is Aphrodite's son. And of course, once again, a very serene, peaceful face. This is what the idealized female form is supposed to look like in the Greek era. Interestingly enough, both the male and female form that the Greeks considered perfect also resurges during the Renaissance. The Renaissance people also think that's the ideal human form. And they just copy it. Obviously today we have different standards, but yeah. Another thing that pops up during the classical period is in architecture. So we're taking a little brief turn to architecture now with capitals. So capitals are at the very, very tops of columns. Some more very sad drawings. So capitals, very top. Column, the long thin thing. Columns usually have fluting on them. The fluting are the little lines that exist in the columns. There are three types of capitals that the Greek invent and use. The first of which is a Doric, very, very plain. The second is an Ionic column capital. Ionic columns would have also some fluting. They would have a base included as well. Doric columns didn't have bases, as odd as that sounds. And Corinthian columns are invented last. Corinthian columns also have bases, also have fluting, and they're extraordinarily ornate on top, and I'm not going to draw them because it's a bunch of leaves. But I can do the Doric and Ionic for you. The Greeks did not invent columns. The Egyptians were already using them a long, long time prior, as well as the Minoans and Mycenaeans, but they did improve upon the capitals. For example, the the Egyptian capital was a bit round in shape. The Minoan and Mycenaean capitals would have been wide at the top and thin at the bottom, which is a bit odd structurally. And the Greeks made a lovely, long, thin, linear column. a lot more delicate than the other two predecessors, and they also added bases and capitals that the other two did not. So once again, your Doric has just that plain capital. Ionic has a more ornate capital. Corinthian has the most complex capital. Ionic and Corinthian would have a base. Doric columns don't. With columns, they're most commonly associated with temples. A temple would have this thing at the top, which is called a frieze. Friezes usually have a bunch of sculptural reliefs in them detailing a story. So along this band here, here, and in these slots here would have been some sort of mythological story having to do with whichever god or goddess that temple was dedicated to. And then of course on top would have been a pediment, which is a lovely little triangle. Before we actually talk about this, let's talk a little bit more about columns. So you can see you have your steps leading up to the temple, the columns. These are just plain Doric columns on the Parthenon. And then you have your frieze and your pediment. Your pediment also has a lot of really high relief sculptures in it usually. Your frieze will have low relief sculptures most commonly, although this one has high relief. It has metaphyse. Bit odd. There's another structure inside of this temple, which also has columns and a frieze. It does not have a pediment on the inside. It just has the frieze. But inside of that smaller structure would have housed a large statue of Athena, which is who this temple is dedicated to. This temple structure and the rest of the Acropolis no longer exists because of different wars that have happened in Greece since then. But originally, for festivals or celebrations, people would make their way in a procession up the steps to the Acropolis. They would pass through minor temples like the Temple of Athena Nike, which would have housed the statue of the winged Nike that we looked at when we were looking at sculpture, the one that didn't have a head or wings because they broke off. Then you would go through the Propylaea into the courtyard area, which would have had a bunch of food stalls and vendors trying to sell you things. And then eventually you would make your way up to the main temple of Athena. There's a bunch of other minor temples surrounding as well. These festivals were not just a daily thing. They would have lasted several days. Really big deal. A lot of drinking, orgies, fun, crazy stuff happens there. Yeah. This is what's left of that today. Yeah, no, not much. This is the Parthenon. If you want to actually see the Parthenon, I recommend you go to Nashville, where they have made an exact replica of what it would have looked like before the roof was blown off. And I literally mean the roof was blown off. A long time ago, well, not that long ago, Turkey invaded Greece and they decided to store all of their gunpowder in the Parthenon, and it caught fire one day and blew the roof off. So here you have a little bit of a closer look of the Doric columns, the frieze that once existed there, and the pediments. The sculptures that were in the pediments were saved by a man named Lord Elgin and donated to the British Museum. Here's what it looks like in Nashville, the copy. So you can see they would have been painted in the background. Here is your pediment showing the battle between the Titans and the gods. And then right below that is your frieze with little metope reliefs. The metope reliefs detail the story of the Lapis and the centaurs again. This is what's left of that. This is in the British Museum. So So, I mean, if you want to see the actual things, you go to London. But that's all that's left. These are really huge sculptures. They're bigger than people. The other opposite, because, I mean, if you go back, you can see that each end has a pediment. So each pediment has a different illustrated story. So this is just one side. The opposite side is here, and it shows a banquet of Athena with some other gods and goddesses. And that's what's left of that one. There's a little bit more of that one. And a lovely little horse's head. Inside of the Parthenon would have once been a really large statue of Athena. You can see how big she once was. This is the replica at Nashville once again. Yeah, if you really want to see the Parthenon, go to Nashville. You can actually see it. That takes us into our third period, which is Hellenistic art. Hellenistic art, like I said earlier, translates to Greek-like. That's because at this point, Greece was trading with a whole bunch of different cultures and Rome was beginning to take over. So they were being influenced by other art styles at this point, more than just the Egyptians. Those other art styles end up infusing into their classical style. So we still see those really realistic, lifelike looking statues and figures being made in the Hellenistic period. But during the Hellenistic period, they aren't as concerned with idealized forms. They're more concerned with emotions. Yes, now we have facial expressions, finally. So a lot of the expressions on these figures are a bit dramatic, over the top, like theatrical acting style. If you've ever been to a theater play, the actors kind of have to over exaggerate some of their emotions to get them across to the viewers. It's like that. Lots of movement, dynamic poses in these art pieces as well. We're going to look at our first Hellenistic piece, which is the Laocoon group, or Laocoon and his sons. This particular story is from mythology. It is about the man Laocoon and his two sons. His sons end up battling a sea serpent and nearly getting eaten, and Laocoon has to go and save them. So with this one, you're going to see facial expressions on both the sons and Laocoon himself. They did use hierarchic scale on this sculpture. Not all Hellenistic sculptures do that, but this one they did, which is a bit odd. So in the mythological story, Laocoon's sons are fully grown. The way this statue is made makes them look like they are small children, but really, really muscular small children. That's a bit odd. But they did that hierarchic proportion so that you could tell who's Laocoon and who are the sons. Otherwise, it might have been a little bit more difficult. And here is that sculpture. So like I mentioned, you can see a lot of emotional expression that you couldn't see before with classical period. We see really, really dynamic movement and poses, even more so and more exaggerated than with the classical period. But you do see that hierarchic scale creates a bit of an odd concept. As I mentioned in the story, these two sons would have been fully grown. To show him in his old age as a really muscular guy with two small, very muscular children is a bit odd, but that was just the stylistic choice that they went with to really show who was who in the sculpture. The serpent also adds to the dynamic pose, as you can see it wrapping around everyone, really helping your eye move throughout the entire sculpture. Now, on to my favorite Hellenistic art style. It really, really captures the overall tone of the Hellenistic period. it is the old woman. During the classical period or archaic period, they never would have depicted a human in old age. They were more interested in showing them in their idealized youthful forms. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, not old. This woman, you can see she has a lot of sunken cheeks, some wrinkles going on. You can see her chest bone area. Her skin is sagging. She's a bit of a mess. They did not idealize her at all. Her pose is also a bit interesting. It's not perfected. She is hunched over. She's also drunk. She is coming home from a Dionysus festival. Dionysus is the god of wine. His festival lasts a week. It's a long week. She is drunk. So that's another reason why she's kind of hunched over, and it's also the reason why her clothes are falling off of her. She would have originally had an arm carrying this basket down here and another arm outstretched. So I just really love this one. It's like the quintessential Hellenistic piece because it's completely opposite of the classical period, but it still incorporates that realism that the classical period did capture, but in a very basic way. It's not a god or goddess. It's not a story from mythology. It's just a basic old woman on her way home, drunk from a festival. An everyday scene for Greece. Okay, and that takes us from Greece into Rome. Rome is a bit different than the Greeks. Like I mentioned, Rome also does have several periods of art, but in this class, we're not going to get to talk about them. Instead, we're just going to go do a really, really brief overview of Roman art at its peak. A lot of it's going to be architecture. The Romans are a lot more well known for their architecture than their art. The Romans are also really good at showing realism in their artwork like the Greeks were, but they don't idealize anything, which is where you can really see in that old woman the influence of Rome. Rome, if you have wrinkles on your face, they're going to give you wrinkles in your portrait. That's how that is. They show it how it is. Same deal with the portrait head of the old man. You can tell he's an old man. He's a senator. A lot of the important senators would get portrait busts made of them. You can tell that he's been stressed previously with his wrinkles and furrowed brow. He's been through a lot, just like that old woman was. So you can really see Rome's influence on that Greek sculpture there. But as I mentioned, with Rome, they're more well known for their architectural achievements than they are their sculptures or paintings. So we are going to be looking at a lot of architecture with Rome. The Romans invented the arch, they invented the dome, they invented concrete, they invented plumbing. They did a lot with architecture. A lot of important stuff. So here's that portrait bust. Like I said, you can really tell it's an old man. They didn't idealize it at all. They showed you what he actually looked like. You'd be able to tell if you lived in this time period, probably who he was as a senator, what his name was, just because he is very individualized here. And as for our first architectural piece, of course, we're going to start with the Colosseum. The Colosseum is a very large Flavian amphitheater. Flavian just means theatrical. If you ever wondered what Flavians were, they're theater actors. It is 3 stories of arches and columns. The columns obviously comprise a colonnade and the arches become an arcade. And the Colosseum, I think we all know, is most well known for its entertaining gladiatorial fights and matches. They also did lion and bear baiting there, so like getting the lions to attack you and then killing them. They did chariot races, and they also once did a naval battle. As for non-violent things, they held plays there, music festivals, and poetry readings as well. And they also crucified Christians. There's that one too. I forgot. There is our Colosseum. You can see the different levels of arches and columns in between. And of course, the top tier is not arches, but you can still see the inlaid columns echoed in the top layer. The Colosseum also has an underground area where they would have held like the animals and the gladiators. So it does go below ground as well. Of course, there's a drainage system for the time they had the naval battle as well. This building was made for a couple of reasons. First of which is people needed a job. So it gave a lot of people a job, build a Colosseum. Second off, it also, after it was finished, gave them some form of entertainment and outlet that had not been previously seen in most civilizations to date. There had been like theaters and plays and things before, but they were usually more for the aristocratic society. This is one of the first examples of something made for the purpose of entertainment of the entire population, not just the wealthy. So it was a very extreme, well, a really popular architectural building for most of the Romans. You'd want to go to the Colosseum to see what they're doing that day. It was an exciting thing. And of course, today you can go on tours of the Colosseum. Has anyone ever been? I had a student once that went on a tour and she videotaped the whole thing. So we got to watch it in class and it was kind of cool. I haven't been. I've only been to Venice, Italy. I haven't been to Rome. Another building, which you will probably get it confused with the Parthenon, because they have the same purpose, is the Pantheon, and they also sound almost identical. The Pantheon is the Roman version of the Parthenon. The Pantheon is another temple, just like the Parthenon was. And the Pantheon houses statues of several Roman gods or goddesses, which are the same exact ones, just different names as the Greeks. The Parthenon only is dedicated to Athena, so that's where it's a little bit different. The Pantheon incorporates a lot of Greek architectural features, but it adds on Roman architectural achievements as well, such as the dome. This is the first example of a dome. Well, not the first example, but the oldest example that we're going to look at. It is the first dome ever. In their dome, they included something called coffers. The coffers are little recessed areas in the ceiling to help take some of the cement weight off of the dome. And there's also an oculus, and you'll understand what all of these things are in a second, I promise. The portico is the porch. I'll point out every single one of these when we get to the picture. The portico or porch area is exactly the way the Greeks made their temples. So you would walk up to the porch and you would see columns and a pediment. But then after that, it's Roman entirely. They don't take Greek style on the rest of the Parthenon, just the porch area. Here is the exterior of the Pantheon. This used to be above ground and you used to have to walk up a bunch of steps to get to it, but because of road paving, it is now slightly underground. So you see once again the Greek columns. These are Corinthian columns with the base and the Corinthian capital. Instead of a frieze like the Greeks did with a bunch of statues, they still did a frieze, but they wrote some words in Latin to tell you what the building's name was, the Pantheon. And then instead of, once again, statues in the pediment, it is a plain pediment. But beyond that, you can tell it is not Greek at all. The Greeks would have had a rectangular shaped temple. The Roman Pantheon is a circle in behind that portico. So here's your portico or porch, and then the actual temple itself is an entire circle structure. Here is the interior. So these recessed squares on the dome help to lift and lighten the load of the dome on the rest of the walls. Those recessed squares are called coffers. A lot of times today, if someone installs coffers, you're not doing it to lighten the load, you're just doing it because it's aesthetically pleasing to look at. The same way that people in homes today will do like recessed tray ceilings sometimes, it's aesthetically pleasing. In the center is that oculus. An oculus is just an eye or an opening in the ceiling. It is entirely open. There is not glass covering it. There's a lot of pigeons inside because of that. But yeah, it lets in the light so that the temple is not entirely pitch black, because other than the oculus, there is no light. Also, they couldn't quite figure out how to close the dome back then. So excuses lead to actual usefulness, I guess, because other than that, there is no light in here besides candles. You can see that each section would have had a statue of a Greek or a Roman goddess inside of it. There are minor recessed areas for minor gods and goddesses up here as well. Later on, when Rome converted to Christianity, those pagan statues were removed and replaced with Christian icons. Today, in the floor of the Pantheon, there are a whole bunch of dead people. They've been burying really, really famous people in the Pantheon for a long time. For example, the artist Raphael is buried in the Pantheon. You can go see the Pantheon today. It looks like this from the outside, and it's very, very gray and concrete on the inside too. And it's super dark. That takes us to Roman paintings. Roman paintings, we don't have too many of left, but the paintings that we do have that are Roman came from Pompeii. Who knows what happened to Pompeii? Volcano, yeah. So Mount Vesuvius erupted on the island of Pompeii, burying the city in a bunch of ash and lava and soot. When that happened, all of the people died, but it did perfectly preserve all of the paintings as well. There's another example of that happening in ancient Aegean culture as well. Another volcano, not Mount Vesuvius, but a different one, and it perfectly preserved everything. So because of Pompeii's Mount Vesuvius disaster, we have paintings from them, we have sculptures from them, we have entire buildings that have been perfectly preserved, as well as all of the technically kind of mummified remains of the people that died there. There's a bunch of museums dedicated to just the bodies of the dead that they've uncovered in Pompeii, and you can Google them, and they're pretty interesting. Like, they uncovered another one a few months ago of a man and his slave, and they were like holding on to each other for dear life. And a bunch of moms and their children holding on to each other. Yeah, it's really interesting. And if you're interested in that, the museums are online and you can look at them, and they're kind of cool. As for the paintings, I would not recommend you Google the paintings, at least not using a school Wi-Fi network. The paintings show a lot of love, eros love, um, not familial love, eros love. They're very luxurious. These paintings would have adorned houses in Pompeii. So think of having a house and on your living room wall, you have a giant painting of, yeah. That's pretty much how it was. They also had mythological stories and tales represented in the mural. And here is one of them. This is like the one example of a PG version that I could find, but even then there's still naked people in it. This is another representation of a Dionysus festival or a Bacchus festival. Bacchus is over here enthroned. Everyone is drinking, eating, and having a good time. Pompeii is known for always having this red background in all of their paintings. No matter which house or villa you went into, it would have a red background, and then the foreground would have had the scene. That Pompeii, well, the red color is given the name now of Pompeii red because all of them had that same red color in the background. So, yeah, red. And that is it for Rome and Greece. Tomorrow we are going to pick back up and finish Christian. I'm not going to try and rush it today because there's a lot of Christian stuff, and I feel like Greece and Rome are enough for just one day. So tomorrow we'll do Christian art, and then we'll do the first half of the Renaissance as well. And then on Monday, I'll zoom through the Northern Renaissance, and you guys will have the rest of Monday's class because that first half won't take long. To start your project, feel free though, if you want to go ahead and start thinking about what objects you're wanting to choose from chapters 18, 19, and 20. If you got free time, just flip through those pages and take a glance at what's there. Yeah, I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good rest of your day. If you still want to pick your own partner,